and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT ranked meta video. Our analysts are here to go through the 11-20 meta for each stage of the game. We'll be covering each aspect of the meta, including stages, items, and compositions. This is our final video on the current meta, as our next one will be a look back at the overall meta of Set 5. With that said, let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Before we begin breaking down the meta, let's first do a brief overview of the 11-20 meta. Overall, the meta is quite varied for patch 11-20. There's plenty of consistent options to choose from, such as Lucian Sentinel, Rangers, or Spellweaver Abomination. Even slightly weaker carries like Draven and Jax can be played in the right circumstances. The only major style of play being left out is reroll builds, as the Hellion reroll composition fell out of favor after being nerfed, though even that build is still playable if a player hits the really good opening for it. But what defines the current meta? Two things which are both related. One is that the pace of the game is slowed down drastically. This comes from the nerfs to reroll compositions, meaning there are fewer boards spiking in the mid-game. It's also come about because of the introduction of the 5-1 Radiant Armory. Players want to be alive long enough to have access to that second Radiant item and be able to use it effectively. Naturally, that means more players are staying alive through Stage 5. And of course, Draconic. Draconic is a major factor in the current meta and also helps slow the game down because anyone utilizing this synergy wants to maximize their egg efficiency. With the pace of the game being slower, Draconic eggs gain more value, especially larger eggs that take 5 turns to hatch. If a player can stay alive long enough to have a few of the larger eggs pop, chances are they'll be able to coast to the end of the game. Of course, it's not a requirement to only play Draconic, but with the buffs the synergy received plus the for fun nature of this patch, it puts Draconic firmly in the driver's seat of the meta. Mixed in with that more of a focus towards late game compositions, meaning 4 and 5 cost carry boards, as well as staying alive long enough to use the 5-1 Radiant item, makes for a lot slower meta than we've had recently. With that brief look at the meta covered, we can switch over to talking about the stages of the game, beginning with the early game. And as usual, we'll start off by going over component priority for the opening carousel. The overall item meta hasn't shifted too much, but the introduction of the second Radiant item has made item priority quite interesting in 11-20. Players can instead focus more towards flexible items because they are likely guaranteed at least one carry item, either on 3-6 or 5-1. That means defensive openers are a lot more common, shifting the priority of components slightly. This shift favors flex players a bit more, though player preference is still a major decider for component priority. Flex players should aim for a belt or the slightly weaker choice of Chain Vest. Belt builds into a lot of useful items, the top early game items being Warmogs and Sunfire Kate. Redemption is also an alright choice, but it does use up a tier, taking away the potential item choices later on. Banshee's Claw is also one of the best utility items, but not all that important early game. And finally, there's Zeke's, an all-around fantastic aura item for AD boards, but again, like Banshee's, not all that high priority early on. Chain Vest is used for Sunfire Cape, Bramble Vest, Stoneplay, and Titan's Resolve. All of those items do well in the early game and have uses later on. Another early game item is Locket, though Rod is usually used for other high priority items. Later on in the game, it's worth making a Shroud, another strong utility item, or Frozen Heart if you have a leftover tier and a good champion to put it on like Diana or Viego. Focusing more towards specific playstyles, AD players will of course want either Sword, Bow, or Glove. Sword is the most common and versatile since it builds into the 3 best AD items, Giant Slayer, Deathblade, and Infinity Edge. Bow is mostly used for Rageblade, which is one of the most common overall items in the meta since it's usable by so many carries. And Glove is used as a secondary component for several items like Infinity Edge, Hand of Justice, Banshee's Claw, Shroud, and Last Whisper. On the other side of the coin, for players that want to focus more on AP boards, the go-to items are Tears and Rods. Tears are essential to make Shojin an item that is necessary for every AP carry besides Karma, though it is even still playable on her. Shojin isn't that high priority early on in the game, but securing a tier can be difficult, so grabbing it from the opening carousel helps a lot. Besides Shojin, Tier can also be used for Hand of Justice, an all-around fantastic flex item, and Archangel Staff, another common carry item for AP champions. As for Rod, the primary use is either Rageblade or Deathcap. Dual Gauntlet is not a bad choice if you do plan to play AP, but Deathcap on average is going to add more damage. Archangels we already mentioned, but keep in mind it does better on high mana pool champions like Heimerdinger and not so well on champions like Karma. Gunblade is generally not used, though the Radiant version can be good on Karma or Vel'Koz. All in all, the item meta hasn't really changed throughout the mid-set. The only major change is the introduction of the second Radiant Armory, meaning flex items are slightly more favorable. But as always, it comes down to player preference. Let's continue on in the early game by talking about Stage 1. The focus here is to find pairs, hit upgrades if possible, and look for strong synergies. There really isn't any secret way to go about Stage 1 because a lot of it comes down to RNG. Did you get a 3-cost drop from an orb? How much gold did you get? What were your shops? These questions are always changing game to game, so play around the opener as best you can. There are a few directions you can go depending on your opener. Any 3-cost champions can be played around with their synergies like Riven with Legionnaire Dawnbringer, Nidalee with Dawnbringer Skirmisher, or Nunu with Brawler Abomination. Ashe and Zyra are particularly high in priority because they open up the door for early Draconic. The only 3 costs unlikely to make much of a difference in the early game are Lux and Lulu, but even they have value because of their synergies. So unless your goal is to hit 10 gold early, the recommended opening strategy is to play off of any 3 costs you get. If you don't hit any, that's fine, just look to 2-star champions and play around their synergies. Moving on, we're into Stage 2. This is a much more involved stage and arguably the most important part of the game. The reason Stage 2 is so important is that having a strong early game will set you up for the rest of the game, both economically and health-wise. Saving health by winning rounds not only earns you more gold, but lessens the pressure you will face later on in the game. So what's the best way to go about Stage 2? Depends a lot on your board, but leveling on standard times, upgrading units, and slamming items is the quick and easy way to at least win rounds. Boss streaking is viable but risky, so only do so if you're comfortable with that playstyle. Plus, there aren't many, if any, common reroll builds to play, so the only reason to force a loss streak is with Draconic or extremely bad luck. Speaking of, Draconic is the way to go right now for the early game if you have the opening for it. Ideally, you want to have the trait active right away on 2-1, but really anytime through Stage 2 is fine. Just keep in mind the later you have Draconic in, the less efficient it will be because it takes time for the eggs to hatch. Other common openers include Hellions, Legionnaire, Dawnbringer, Sentinel Skirmisher, and Nightbringer. Most synergies have ways to be played in the early game depending on what champions you found or 2-starred. Whichever route you take in the early game, make sure you're keeping up with levels with the rest of the lobby and trying to build your economy as best you can. With that, we can move into the mid-game with Stage 3. The goal in Stage 3 is to level at 3-2 and, if possible, try not to roll any gold. Since the pace of the game is slower than it has been, this should be doable as there will be less pressure applied by other players. That said, there are common synergies that do well at level 6. Those are Skirmishers, Sentinels, and Abomination. Skirmishers' main power spike is during Stage 3 and 4, since 6 Skirmishers are easier to hit then, even without Jax. 6 Sentinels also doable at level 6, but rare since you need either Gallia or Lucian. Abomination is quite common since activating the trait requires mostly low-cost champions, but the strength of Abomination relies a lot on your early carry and what items you have for the monstrosity. Keep an eye out for those synergies and champions, as it's fine to roll a little bit of gold to hit those power spikes. Be sure to scout as well, since you don't want to be caught off guard by others hitting. But as we said, the overall goal of Stage 3 is to coast through it and hit 50 gold with the goal of leveling to 7 sometime between 3-5 and 4-1. Aggressive leveling is mostly reserved only for players that high roll and want to preserve a win streak. Quickly touching on the Radiant Armory on 3-6. Since there's now a second armory, there's less pressure to grab a carry Radiant item. Instead, you can play whatever item adds the most value to your board right there. This varies game to game, but keep in mind you will have another option later on in the game. Now for Stage 4, where you either want to level to 7 or already be level 7. At this point, it's common to roll, looking to hit 4-cost champions to build a composition around. With the pace of the game being slower, players don't have to all in at level 7. Instead, it's common to roll maybe 10 or 20 gold to stabilize and then save the rest for a faster level 8. Only roll more gold if your board is weak, and losing multiple rounds as saving health is more important than saving gold. Before we move into the late game, let's go over a few common meta compositions. As we've said, most of the meta revolves around 4 and 5 cost carries. There aren't many low-cost champions to play for, especially when it comes to reroll boards. That said, Hellion reroll is viable with the right opening, as is Vayne 3. For 3-cost champions, it is possible to run Yasuo with Nightbringer Legionnaire, but the only way to really succeed with it is having a Cavalier emblem on Yasuo. The only 3-cost champion that is slightly common is Ashe 3 with Draconic, but that's more of a Draconic composition than a reroll build. Draconic in general is the bulk of the meta, either with Ashe 3 carry, Heimerdinger carry, or Zyra. Vel'Koz is also a common pairing with Draconic, as is Abomination. The rest of the meta is all about 4 and 5 cost champions. Lucian Sentinel is still by far the most consistent. Rangers, meaning Aphelios Akshan, is less consistent but has a stronger late game. Draven Legionnaire is a bit on the fringe but is still playable, as is Jax Knights. AP boards mainly focus on either Spellweaver Abomination or Draconic Heimerdinger, with Karma Dawnbringer occasionally doing well. Gwen and Teemo are also viable late game pivots for AP boards. All in all, there's plenty of compositions that are viable in the meta, though almost all of them are mid to late game focused. Now it's time for the late game. This primarily begins in Stage 5 when the lobby will be hitting level 8 sometime between 5-1 and 5-5. This can be done earlier, but as long as you level to 8 in Stage 5, you'll be fine. The goal here is to finish putting together your main composition and begin upgrading everything. Keep in mind there is a new Radiant Armory on 5-1, so try to grab whichever item helps your board out the most for the late game. And that really is it for the late game, as level 9 is rarely ever achievable. The only economic decisions to make late game are which 5 costs to add to your board and whether or not it's viable to 3-star 4 cost. 5 cost champions in particular to look for are Teemo to counter AD compositions, Gwen for Mystic and to hold AP items, Volibear with Revenants, Heimerdinger is an AP carry pivot, and Viego if you're running Diana or Draven. What matters most in the late game is scouting and positioning, as focusing on those two mechanics will earn you more round wins than anything else. And as we always say, put more attention towards the earlier stages of the game, as improving there will naturally lead to a better late game and higher consistent placements. And that's all for today, folks. Overall, we're ending Set 5 on a high note with patch 1120. There is one more patch to go, but it's likely we'll see the majority of players turn their focus towards Set 6, which is poised to launch PBE next Tuesday. Let us know in the comment section below what you've enjoyed the most from patch 1120. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.